Hey guys, tonight we begin with what punishments were really like in medieval times. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me no in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The first thing to understand about medieval punishments is that they were never designed simply to correct behavior or keep order, quietly in the way modern legal systems attempt. In the Middle Ages, punishments were meant to be public, memorable, and above all, terrifying. Justice was as much about teaching everyone else a lesson as it was about punishing the guilty party. A trial was not always about fairness, but about reinforcing the social order, the hierarchy of the village or town, and the authority of the crown, church, or lord. Picture, for a moment, the village square. It is the heart of communal life, where markets are held, where gossip spreads, and where the community gathers to celebrate feasts or watch traveling entertainers. It is also the stage for justice. On a raised wooden platform sits a set of stocks, ready to trap ankles and wrists. Sometimes nearby stands the whipping post, or even a pillory, where a man or woman can be locked by the neck and wrists, exposed to ridicule and more tangible forms of pain. Medieval punishments were intended to take place in the same public space where people lived their daily lives, so that reminders of consequences were never far from sight. When you imagine these punishments, you might assume they were only used for the most severe crimes, but that is far from the truth. In medieval Europe, people were punished for everything from theft to gossip, from poaching a rabbit on a lord's land to speaking out against the church. Even minor missteps could bring public humiliation, and because communities were small and tightly knit, a public shame could haunt someone for years. Long after the initial pain of the punishment was over, one of the simplest and most common punishments was the use of the stocks. Wooden boards with carved holes for hands and feet would clamp shut around the limbs of the guilty. Once restrained, the condemned was left on display in the center of town. Their neighbors and strangers alike might jeer, spit, or pelt them with rotten vegetables, mud, or worse. What is striking to modern audiences is how punishment was not just delivered by an authority figure, but by the community itself. People were expected to participate, to enforce the shame, to show by their actions that they stood on the side of order and morality. For those guilty of theft, the punishment could escalate depending on the severity of the crime. A petty thief might be whipped through the streets while others shouted at them, but repeat offenders could lose a hand. Amputation was a visible and permanent mark of guilt that lingered for the rest of a person's life. It was both punishment and stigma, serving as a warning to others and ensuring that the offender would never again blend unnoticed into society. The methods of punishment also reveal a great deal about medieval ideas of morality. For crimes considered sins against the church, heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft, punishments were often harsher and more spectacular. To speak against the church was to threaten the order of the universe itself, and so trials could end in execution by fire, a method that symbolized purifying the soul even as it inflicted terrible suffering. Though executions were rare compared to lesser punishments, when they did occur, they were performed in public, with the whole community summoned to bear witness. Children, elders, the guilty and the innocent alike stood in the crowd, absorbing the message. This is what happens when someone defies the laws of God or man. But not all punishments required blood or fire. Humiliation was a powerful weapon in medieval society, and it was wielded with surprising creativity. A gossipy woman might be forced to wear a bridle-like device called a scold's bridle, a metal mask fitted with a tongue clamp to prevent her from speaking. Imagine the weight of the iron pressing against her skin, the cold taste of metal against her mouth, while neighbors watched her parade through the streets. It was not simply her words that were silenced, but her reputation, her standing in the community crushed under the weight of mockery. Other humiliating punishments included being forced to carry heavy objects through the streets as penance, sometimes barefoot, sometimes wearing nothing but a shift, all the while enduring the taunts of onlookers. The goal was not only to shame the individual, but to bind the community together in a shared spectacle. It is easy to forget that in an age before newspapers, television, or social media, the village square was where news spread fastest. Public punishments provided a kind of drama, a story retold and embellished, a warning carried into every household. And yet, punishments were not always imposed by the state or church alone. In rural villages, local lords and councils often devised their own forms of justice, drawing on tradition, superstition, and custom. A poacher caught stealing game from the lord's forest might be hung by his wrists for hours or made to pay fines he could scarcely afford. Sometimes the punishment was designed less to correct and more to remind the poor of their place. The land, the animals, the woods, they belonged to the Lord, and trespassing against them was not only theft but rebellion. It is worth pausing to reflect on how justice was carried out. In many cases, trials themselves were little more than formalities. Evidence, as we think of it today, was rare. Witnesses could be unreliable, and oaths often carried more weight than facts. Sometimes the accused was subjected to trial by ordeal. This meant being forced to carry a red-hot iron a certain distance, or to plunge a hand into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly, the accused was declared innocent by God's will. If infection set in, it was proof of guilt. In such a world, punishment was not only brutal but unpredictable, with outcomes resting on faith, fear, and the interpretation of divine signs. For the poor, punishments were harshest, since they lacked the wealth to pay fines or bribe officials. Wealthy offenders could sometimes avoid physical penalties by paying money, but peasants and commoners rarely had that option. As a result, it was the lower classes who most often found themselves whipped, mutilated, or shamed before their neighbors. Justice, in other words, was not blind. It was deeply tied to power, status, and the ability to pay one's way out of trouble. Imagine, then, the daily life of a villager in medieval times. Alongside the struggle to grow food, pay taxes, and survive disease, there was always the looming presence of punishment. A careless word, a desperate theft, or an unlucky accusation could drag someone before the public eye. The fear of punishment shaped behavior, encouraged obedience, and maintained the fragile order of society. To live in a medieval village was not just to toil and endure hunger. It was to live under constant watch, with the shadow of punishment never far away. This is the world we are about to explore in greater detail, the harsh and unforgettable reality of medieval punishments. Over the next segments, we will move deeper into the stories, the instruments, and the atmosphere of justice in the Middle Ages, tracing not only how punishments were delivered, but also how they shaped the very fabric of life. For in understanding how people were punished, we begin to understand how they lived, feared, and ultimately endured in a time very different from our own. If you close your eyes and place yourself into the rhythm of a medieval day, you would soon sense the undercurrent of fear that threaded through village life. The ringing of the church bell might summon you to prayer, to market, or to work in the fields, but it could also call you to witness punishment. And once the crowd gathered, there was no escaping the lesson being taught. Men, women, and even children were expected to observe what happened to those who broke the law. This was part of their education, as much as learning the catechism or the duties of feudal service. The punishments themselves, when examined closely, reveal an almost theatrical quality. They were staged for maximum effect, not just to make the guilty suffer, but to strike into the hearts of those who watched. Think of the pillory, that most iconic device of medieval justice. At first glance, it was simply a wooden frame with holes for the neck and wrists. But in practice, it transformed a person into a living display of disgrace. Once locked in, the punished was forced to stand, exposed and vulnerable, while townsfolk gathered around. The pillory turned crime into spectacle, humiliation into entertainment. People came not only to jeer, but to participate. The condemned could be showered with spoiled vegetables, dung, or stones. Children might laugh and throw mud, while adults hurled insults about the crime. Sometimes the punishment lasted hours, sometimes days. There are even accounts of people dying in the pillory, not because the device itself was fatal, but because the crowd's hostility grew too violent. What began as a symbol of communal order could erupt into mob cruelty. In this way, punishments revealed the darker sides of human nature, where anger and self-righteousness blurred into violence. Another form of punishment, particularly common in smaller villages, was the whipping post. A man or woman tied to the post would be lashed with a whip, the sharp crack echoing through the square. The sound alone was enough to chill onlookers, but the real power of the punishment lay in its repetition. Each lash marked both the skin of the offender and the memory of the community. Whippings were quick, brutal, and often witnessed by children, who carried the image into adulthood as a reminder of what awaited those who strayed. Punishments for moral offenses were especially severe. In a world where the church and law were intertwined, sins could easily become crimes. Take, for example, adultery. A woman caught in an affair might be forced to walk through the village in nothing but a simple shift, holding a candle as a sign of her sin. Men could be whipped or fined, but women were often made into public examples because their bodies were seen as dangerous, their sexuality as something that needed controlling. The shame was not confined to the offender. Alone it spread to her family, staining their reputation for years. Then there were punishments tied to dishonesty. Bakers who sold bread that was underweight, cheating customers, might be dragged through the streets with their loaves hung round their necks. Dishonest traders could be nailed by the ear to a post as a warning. Imagine the sting of the nail-piercing flesh, the struggle to stay still until it was finally removed. These punishments were not random. They were crafted to match the crime, a kind of symbolic justice that made the lesson even clearer. Superstition also shaped punishment. If crops failed or illness spread, someone might be accused of witchcraft. While the great witch hunts of Europe mostly took place in later centuries, medieval communities still lived with the fear of hidden sorcery. A woman who muttered strange words, a healer whose remedies failed, or a neighbor who seemed too unlucky or too fortunate could be dragged before a crowd and punished. Sometimes the accused were subjected to ordeals, like being thrown into water. If they floated, it was proof they were unnatural and guilty. If they sank, it was a sign of innocence, though drowning often made that judgment meaningless. The cruelty of these ordeals highlights a crucial truth about medieval justice. It was not always about evidence or reason, but about reinforcing beliefs. The ordeal by fire or water was not a test in the modern sense, but a ritual, a way of letting God's judgment be revealed through suffering. When the wounds healed cleanly or the body miraculously survived, it was seen as divine intervention. But when the accused failed, the punishment seemed inevitable, fated beyond question. In this way, justice and faith became inseparable, binding communities together through fear of divine retribution. Of course, the brutality of punishments did not go unquestioned. There were those, even in the Middle Ages, who criticized excessive cruelty. Some churchmen argued that mercy was as important as justice, and a few rulers tried to curb the harshest penalties. But the underlying system of public, humiliating punishment remained. It endured because it was effective not in reforming individuals, but in controlling societies. Fear of shame, fear of pain, and fear of exclusion were powerful forces in a world where survival depended on community ties. Consider the punishment of exile. It might seem mild compared to whipping or mutilation, but for a medieval villager, exile was devastating. To be driven out of one's community meant losing not only home and livelihood, but also protection. Bandits roamed the roads, wild animals haunted the forests, and without neighbors to rely on, survival was slim. In some cases, exile was as good as a death sentence, just drawn out over weeks or months instead of moments. The punishment illustrates how deeply social bonds mattered in the medieval world and how punishment could sever them with fatal consequences. What also emerges when we study these punishments is a culture of spectacle. Executions, in particular, were treated almost like festivals. When someone was condemned to hang, the entire town turned out. Vendors sold food, musicians might play, and families brought children to witness the event. It was considered an important civic duty, a chance to see justice enacted with one's own eyes. The condemned might confess before the crowd, begging forgiveness or cursing their enemies. And when the trapdoor opened or the rope tightened, silence would fall, followed by a murmur as people carried the image home in their minds. Executions could be slow and torturous or swift, depending on the crime and the status of the condemned. A noble might be beheaded with a sword, a quicker and cleaner death, while a peasant might be hanged, left to dangle as the crowd watched. In some places, traitors faced even harsher ends, such as being drawn and quartered. These punishments were not only about the guilty, they were messages to everyone else, reminders of the ultimate power of rulers and the peril of disobedience. At the same time, not every punishment was so severe. Many minor crimes resulted in fines, especially for those who could pay. This created a striking contrast between rich and poor. A wealthy merchant caught breaking a rule might pay a sum of money and walk free, while a poor laborer accused of the same offense might be whipped or branded. Justice, in other words, was not equally applied, and people knew it. Yet the system persisted because inequality itself reinforced the order of medieval life. As we sift through these details, what becomes clear is that punishments were not random cruelty but deliberate tools of power. Each lash of the whip, each rotten apple thrown at someone in the stocks, each bell rung to summon a crowd, all of these were performances of authority. They reminded people of where they stood in the hierarchy, of the dangers of disobedience, and of the presence of divine judgment in earthly matters. Punishment was, in many ways, a language, and everyone in the Middle Ages was fluent in it. So when we imagine medieval life, we must remember not just the castles and cathedrals, the knights and feasts, but the darker scenes too. The woman locked in the scold's bridle, her neighbors laughing as she stumbles. The thief with his hand freshly severed, blood marking the ground as a warning. The child pressed close to his father's side as they watch a hanging in silence. These were not exceptions, but realities, woven into the very fabric of daily existence. And yet, life went on. After the punishment was done, the crowd dispersed, and the market returned to its usual bustle. People laughed, traded, argued, and prayed, carrying with them the memory of what they had seen. Punishment was both an interruption and a continuation of life. A reminder that even in the ordinary rhythm of days, fear and authority stood close at hand. It is within this tension between survival and spectacle, cruelty and community, that the true nature of medieval punishments emerges. To walk the streets of a medieval town was to live under constant watch, not only by neighbors but also by the looming presence of law and church. Crime and punishment were not abstract notions. They shaped everyday life. A gossiping tongue, a stolen loaf, a drunken quarrel, or even suspicion of sorcery could bring someone before the judgment of their peers. And when punishment was declared, it rarely happened behind closed doors. Instead, it unfolded in full view of the community, where every eye became part of the sentence. The pillory and the stocks, often confused in the modern imagination, served different but related purposes. The pillory held a person standing upright, their head and hands trapped in wooden boards. The stocks, by contrast, forced the guilty to sit or lie down, their legs clamped in place. Both rendered a body helpless, on display, and vulnerable to whatever the crowd chose to inflict. It was a punishment that turned shame into spectacle, and unlike imprisonment, it required no hidden expense or maintenance. The crowd became the enforcer, the tormentor, and often the true judge. Punishments also targeted the voice, especially in cases of slander or gossip. The scold's bridle, sometimes called a brank, was a metal cage fitted around the head, with a piece of iron pressing into the tongue. Worn by women accused of nagging, gossiping, or speaking out of turn, it silenced them in the most literal and humiliating way. Imagine being forced to stumble through the streets, the iron biting into your mouth, while onlookers jeered. The punishment did not just quiet a voice. It sent a chilling message about whose voices mattered and whose did not. For men, other humiliations applied. A thief might be tied to a cart and dragged through the town while being whipped. The public exposure mattered more than the lashes. Everyone saw his disgrace, and the shame followed him long after his wounds healed. For petty crimes, branding was common. A hot iron pressed into the skin left a permanent mark, a scarlet letter burned into flesh. It announced guilt wherever the person went, a punishment that lasted a lifetime. The medieval imagination was deeply symbolic, and punishments often mirrored the crime. A liar could have his tongue pierced or cut. A thief might lose a hand. A woman who poisoned food might be forced to drink a concoction of her own making. This poetic justice felt natural in a world where morality and law intertwined, where the body itself became the canvas of judgment. But beyond the physical and symbolic, punishments had a deeply social function. They were lessons staged for the entire community. To see someone whipped or shamed was to internalize the cost of disobedience. Children clutched their parents' hands tighter. Merchants thought twice before cheating. Women curbed their tongues in fear of the bridle. The spectacle of punishment turned fear into discipline, shaping behavior without constant enforcement. Still, one cannot ignore the cruelty, nor the pleasure people sometimes took in watching. Human beings, then as now, were drawn to drama, and the suffering of others became a grim form of entertainment. Executions in particular drew crowds as large as any fair. Gallows stood tall at the edge of towns, visible reminders of ultimate authority. When a hanging was announced, markets slowed, homes emptied, and people gathered. Children perched on shoulders to see, and the condemned often spoke last words, confessing sins or begging for mercy. Executions could also be staged for maximum terror. Burning at the stake, reserved for heretics or witches, created a spectacle of both fire and faith. The flames licked higher as smoke billowed, and people believed they were watching the soul itself being judged. Treason invited even harsher ends, drawing and quartering, where the body was torn apart piece by piece. These were not merely punishments. There were statements, declarations that authority could reach into the very body and unmake it. Yet, despite the harshness, punishment also carried rituals of forgiveness. A thief might be whipped, but then allowed back into the village. An adulterer might endure shame, but be reconciled to the community. Punishment was a cycle, designed not always to destroy, but to restore, albeit through pain and fear. It was as much about reintegration as exclusion, even if the path back was humiliating. And so, we find the paradox of medieval punishment. It was brutal, yet deeply structured, cruel, yet purposeful, feared, yet familiar. It taught lessons through pain and spectacle, through symbols carved into flesh and memories etched into minds. Justice in the Middle Ages was not blind but vivid, loud and unforgettable. Every punishment carried meaning, and every villager knew its weight. When we reflect on these practices today, they can seem barbaric, distant, even alien. But for the people who lived then, they were ordinary. Punishment was not an interruption of life. It was part of its rhythm, a thread woven through the fabric of daily existence. The ringing of the bell, the gathering of the crowd, the cries of the punished, all of these were as familiar as the sounds of prayer or the toll of the market. They reminded everyone of their place in the order of things, of the peril of disobedience, and of the fragility of mercy. Thus, to truly grasp medieval life, we must step into this world of punishment, not as distant observers, but as villagers ourselves. We must feel the shiver when the bell tolls, the murmur of the crowd, the crack of the whip, the acrid smoke of a burning stake. Only then can we begin to understand what punishments were really like, not abstract tales of cruelty, but living, breathing experiences that shaped the medieval soul. The medieval world did not view crime and punishment in the way we do today. To us, punishment is largely tied to the state, carried out behind closed doors, and aimed at, least in principle, toward rehabilitation. But in the Middle Ages, punishment belonged to everyone, the community, the church, and the sovereign. To be punished was to be displayed, to be made an example, and often to be reconciled afterward. The process was raw, immediate, and unavoidable. Consider the practice of public penance, one of the most common punishments in Christian Europe. A sinner, perhaps, guilty of adultery, theft, or blasphemy would be made to strip down to a simple shift and walk barefoot through the town to the church. Sometimes ashes were rubbed on the head as a sign of shame. The offender might be forced to carry a candle or a heavy stone, symbolizing the burden of sin. This was not only humiliation, but also performance, a ritual of cleansing before God and neighbor alike. The community watched, but it also participated, witnessing repentance and confirming forgiveness. Fines were another common penalty, particularly for those with means. A wealthy man could sometimes pay his way out of harsher punishments, turning his silver into mercy. But fines were not only about money, they reinforced social hierarchy. To pay a fine was to acknowledge authority, to bow to the power of lord, king, or church. It was an exchange of wealth for honor restored. Yet for the poor, unable to pay, alternatives such as flogging or labor were imposed, reminding everyone that justice was never equal. One particularly vivid form of punishment was the charivari, or rough music. If someone was accused of immorality, adultery, cruelty, or even simply marrying wrong, the community itself might gather outside their house with pots, pans, and horns, clanging and shouting into the night. The noise was deafening, the shame unbearable. Sometimes effigies were paraded through the village to mock the guilty. This was justice, not by court decree, but by popular will, an expression of the collective conscience. It blurred the line between punishment and festivity, making ridicule a weapon as sharp as any blade. There were also punishments, meant to control behavior within tightly defined roles. Women were often singled out, their transgressions tied to speech, sexuality, or domestic duties. A nagging wife might find herself ducked in a pond, strapped into a chair and plunged repeatedly into the cold water while neighbors laughed. The punishment was harsh, humiliating, and often dangerous. Yet it reflected the values of the age: silence, obedience, and order within the household. Men, meanwhile, faced public whippings for drunkenness or brawling, their masculine pride battered as much as their bodies. The medieval imagination extended even to the afterlife when considering punishment. Excommunication, the denial of the sacraments, was one of the most feared penalties. To be cut off from the church was to be cut off from salvation itself. The shame was not only temporal but eternal. Villagers might avoid speaking to or trading with the excommunicated, treating them as already dead. Unlike the whip or the stocks, excommunication wounded the soul, and reconciliation required profound penance. Still, one cannot escape the physicality of medieval justice. Torture, though not as widespread as often imagined, played a role in extracting confessions. Devices such as the rack, the strappado, or the thumbscrew inflicted excruciating pain, designed less to punish than to compel words. Confession was vital, for without it, justice seemed incomplete. The medieval belief held that truth could be forced from the body, that pain itself might reveal the hidden soul. Not all punishments were so severe. Children, for instance, were sometimes whipped lightly in school, or made to memorize psalms as correction. Minor offenses might be met with a stint in the pillory or an afternoon cleaning streets. But even these lighter punishments reinforced the same principle. Behavior was always under watch, and deviation invited correction. The presence of punishment was woven into the very geography of towns and villages. Stocks were often placed in the market square, gallows erected on prominent hills, and whipping posts near churchyards. These were not hidden structures, but landmarks of justice, as familiar as wells or crossroads. The architecture of punishment reminded everyone that order was always visible, that consequences lurked in plain sight, and yet, despite all the harshness, we must remember that medieval people did not see themselves as cruel. To them, punishment was necessary for balance, for salvation, for the health of society. They believed that sin and crime threatened not only individuals but entire communities. One person's wrongdoing invited divine wrath on all. To punish was to protect, to cleanse, to restore harmony. The lash, the bridle, the fire, they were tools not of sadism but of order. But as centuries passed, voices began to question these methods. Some priests argued that excessive cruelty corrupted justice. Some lords realized that executions robbed them of laborers. And gradually, imprisonment began to replace spectacle, fines to replace floggings, and courts to replace mob justice. The medieval world gave way to something new, though the echoes of its punishments still haunt us in stories, sayings, and symbols. By the close of the Middle Ages, punishments had grown less frequent, but no less feared. The gallows still stood, the stocks still waited, and the whip still cracked. But whispers of change stirred. Mercy, reform, and discipline began to rival shame and cruelty. The balance shifted, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, and so, when we imagine medieval punishments today, we see both the brutality and the order, the spectacle and the meaning. We see a world that believed in justice as something visible, public, and immediate. A world where punishment was not hidden but lived, not abstract but embodied. A world where fear and faith walked hand in hand. To step into this world is to feel the cold iron of the stocks, the burn of the whip, the crushing weight of shame. It is to hear the laughter of the crowd, the toll of the church bell, the hush before the executioner's hand. It is to realize that punishment in medieval times was not only about crime, was about community, about power, about the very fabric of life. As we shift further into the realities of medieval punishment, it becomes clear that the system was never entirely consistent. Justice in this period was highly localized, deeply shaped by who held authority in a given region, whether a feudal lord, a bishop, or even the villagers themselves. What one town considered a fine-worthy offense, another might punish with whipping or banishment. To live in the Middle Ages was to live within a patchwork of customs, laws, and rituals of discipline, where your fate depended as much on where you were as on what you had done. One of the defining features of punishment in this age was its visibility. Medieval people believed that justice had to be seen to be real. An execution carried out in secret would have seemed suspicious, even unjust. To prevent rumors and reinforce authority, punishment had to be staged, like a theater of morality. Gallows were built on hills where they could be seen from miles away. Town squares doubled as courts and theaters of discipline. In many ways, justice was performance, and the audience was everyone. Take the example of the pillory. To us, it may seem like a relatively harmless punishment. A wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, where an offender would be locked for hours or days. But the true punishment lay not in the discomfort, though that was real, but in the exposure. While in the pillory, the criminal was utterly vulnerable to the crowd. Passersby could jeer, insult, or hurl rotten food, mud, even stones. For the wealthy or powerful, this was devastating humiliation. For the poor, it was a reminder that society could strip away even dignity itself. Yet in some cases, sympathy might emerge. There are recorded instances where townsfolk offered food or drink to someone in the pillory, showing that punishment could produce not only scorn but solidarity. Public executions were another matter entirely. Executions were not only punishments but also rituals of power. The condemned person might be paraded through the streets, forced to confess or pray aloud, then led to the scaffold where the executioner awaited. Crowds gathered in their thousands, drawn by morbid curiosity but also by duty. To witness was to participate in justice. The method of execution varied: hanging, beheading, burning, or breaking on the wheel. But in all cases, the act was intended to terrify and instruct. As the body of the condemned swung, burned, or broke, the message was unmistakable. This could be you unless you obey. Not all punishments were deadly, of course. Branding, mutilation, and flogging were frequently used to mark or correct offenders without killing them. A thief might have an ear cropped or a hand branded with a hot iron, forever carrying the mark of their crime. A liar could have their tongue pierced with a metal rod. These punishments were designed to be permanent reminders, visible proof of wrongdoing etched onto the body. Unlike prison sentences today, which end, these punishments lasted a lifetime. The scar or missing limb became a living sentence, carried into every encounter, every market exchange, every prayer at church. It is important to recognize that the church played as great a role as the secular courts. Clerical courts often dealt with cases of heresy, adultery, blasphemy, and other sins that strayed into the territory of crime. Their punishments, while less bloody, were no less significant. Pilgrimages were sometimes imposed as penance. Forcing a sinner to travel hundreds of miles to a shrine is both punishment and spiritual purification. For a villager, this could mean leaving behind family and livelihood for months, even years. The punishment lay not only in the journey, but in the public acknowledgement of sin. The sight of a neighbor setting out in rags with a pilgrim's staff was a spectacle as powerful as any whipping. For repeat offenders or those considered unredeemable, exile was another common punishment. To be exiled was to be cast out of one's community, forbidden from returning on pain of death. This was perhaps the harshest punishment, short of execution, for community was life. Stripped of home, kin, and the protection of law, an exile wandered as an outcast, vulnerable to hunger, bandits, and despair. In a world where survival depended on belonging, exile was a slow death, one of isolation rather than the sword. Children too were subject to punishment, though in different ways. Medieval parents and teachers often believed that the rod was essential to learning. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not a metaphor but a creed. Schoolmasters whipped pupils for poor recitation, inattentiveness, or misbehavior. Parents disciplined children with belts or switches. Yet children also endured punishments designed to shame rather than injure, wearing dunce caps, standing in corners, or being paraded through the streets. For medieval society, discipline was the foundation of order, and no one was too young to learn it. Perhaps one of the most revealing punishments of the era was trial by ordeal. These were not punishments in themselves, but tests used to determine guilt or innocence. A person accused of theft might be forced to plunge their hand into boiling water and retrieve a stone. If the wound healed cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it festered, guilty. Others might be bound and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty, for the water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned in the process. These ordeals seem cruel and senseless to us, but to medieval people, they were sacred. The ordeal was a way of letting God reveal the truth. of placing justice in divine rather than human hands. Of course, ordeals eventually gave way to more formal courts, but the memory of them lingered. They speak to a worldview in which the supernatural and the judicial were inseparable. To punish was not only to uphold law, but to maintain the cosmic balance between sin and righteousness. Every blow of the whip, every toll of the bell, every body swinging from the gallows was a sign that order was restored, that God's justice still held sway. And yet, beneath this order, we can glimpse the cracks. Some punishments backfired, sparking riots or rebellions. Executions could turn criminals into martyrs if the crowd sympathized. Public shaming could draw pity rather than scorn. In some towns, villagers resisted or sabotaged punishments they considered unjust, freeing prisoners or hiding exiles. These moments remind us the medieval people were not passive recipients of authority. They questioned, resisted, and sometimes overturned it. Still, the overwhelming reality was that punishment in the medieval world was inescapable. Whether through the lash, the fine, the pilgrimage, or the ordeal, justice reached into every corner of life. To live in this time was to know that one's actions were never private, that the gaze of community, church, and sovereign was always present. Punishment was not simply an event, but a constant shadow, shaping behavior, fear, and identity. By the close of this first part of our exploration, one truth emerges clearly. Punishment in the Middle Ages was not merely about crime. It was about power, about morality, about the very definition of what it meant to live rightly in a dangerous, fragile world. It was as much about the soul as the body, as much about order as retribution, and it was never hidden, never quiet, never invisible. To be punished was to be known, to be remembered, and to be reshaped in the eyes of all. If we look deeper into the fabric of medieval life, punishments were not isolated events, but threads woven tightly into the culture itself. They were teaching moments, warnings, and, in many ways, communal rituals that told everyone present how power flowed and where danger lay. To understand these punishments fully, we must step into the marketplace, the churchyard, the castle hall, and the village green places where these acts unfolded before the eyes of men, women, and children. The medieval town square was not merely a place of trade. It was a stage. Imagine a bustling morning in a small market town. Merchants call out their wares, peasants bring their produce, children dart through the crowds, and then a sudden silence spreads as a crier's bell rings. All eyes turn toward the raised platform or the pillory standing near the church steps. A sentence is about to be carried out. The condemned is brought forward, perhaps bound with ropes, sometimes barefoot, sometimes stripped of their outer garments to emphasize shame. Their crime is read aloud in a clear, formal voice so that all may hear. The punishment begins, and with it, the spectacle. This spectacle was important because medieval society was structured around reputation and honor. To lose reputation was as devastating as to lose property. Public humiliation therefore struck at the heart of medieval life. A man beaten in the square, or a woman made to wear a scold's bridle, a metal contraption, with a plate that pressed against the tongue to prevent speaking, was marked in memory. Neighbors, family, even future generations might whisper about it. Punishment was not only pain in the moment. It was a story that lingered, shaping how others saw you for years to come. Women in particular were subject to punishments that reinforced social expectations about obedience and speech. The scold's bridle, mentioned earlier, was designed for women accused of gossiping, nagging, or speaking out of turn. While locked into the device, they could neither speak nor eat, and they were often paraded through the town for all to see. This punishment reveals much about gender roles in the medieval world. Silence and submission were demanded, and those who defied it were forced into humiliating displays. Yet accounts also reveal that crowds sometimes sympathized with the punished woman, mocking her accusers instead. Once again, the audience was never entirely predictable. Another gendered punishment was the ducking stool, often used against women accused of being scolds, witches, or immoral. Bound to a wooden chair attached to a long beam, the woman was dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. Onlookers laughed or jeered as she gasped for air, waterlogged and shivering. Though often non-lethal, it could lead to illness, injury, or even drowning. The punishment was both physical and symbolic, a cleansing meant to rid the community of disruptive behavior. But if we turn our gaze toward men, the range of punishments was equally varied and brutal. Soldiers guilty of desertion might be flogged before their comrades, forced to march barefoot, or branded so they could never escape their shame. Thieves faced hanging if the crime was serious enough, though lesser thefts could result in mutilation, such as losing a hand or ear. These bodily marks made it impossible to hide from one's past. The thief without a hand could never escape suspicion. Even years later, he was identified at a glance. At the higher levels of crime, treason, rebellion, or heresy, punishments escalated into spectacles of horror. One of the most infamous was drawing and quartering in England, reserved for traitors. The condemned was dragged on a hurdle or wooden frame to the place of execution, hanged until near death, then disemboweled, beheaded, and finally cut into 4 pieces. Each quarter might be sent to a different city as a warning. Though horrifying, this punishment was carefully staged to emphasize the total destruction of a traitor's body and memory. To betray king or country was to lose every part of oneself. Burning at the stake was another punishment reserved for heresy or witchcraft. It was not only a physical death, but a symbolic one. Fire was seen as purifying, a way of cleansing sin in the most absolute sense. The condemned, tied to a post, surrounded by faggots, faced the crowd as flames rose. Some accounts describe people reciting prayers, singing hymns, or even declaring their innocence as the smoke choked their voices. The crowd, again, was a crucial part of this event, some weeping in pity, others shouting in approval, all taking away the lesson that faith and loyalty must never waver. Despite their severity, these punishments were not applied at random. They reflected deep beliefs about order, justice, and divine will. Medieval people saw crime not only as a personal failing, but as a disruption to the cosmic balance. A thief was not just stealing goods, he was offending God's law. A heretic was not just speaking falsehoods, he was threatening the salvation of the community. Punishment, therefore, was both correction and purification. To let a crime go unpunished was dangerous, for it might invite divine wrath upon the whole town. And yet, we must also remember that mercy existed alongside cruelty. Monarchs sometimes issued pardons, influenced by petitions, bribes, or political motives. Lords might spare a peasant to maintain goodwill or labor supply. The church encouraged confession and penance, which could reduce or replace harsh punishment. Pilgrimages, donations to monasteries, or long fasts could substitute for physical pain. These acts of leniency remind us that the medieval world was not uniformly brutal. It contained negotiation, compromise, and moments of forgiveness. Still, punishments were inescapably public, and this publicity made them effective tools of social control. The fear of the pillory, the shame of the scold's bridle, the horror of the gallows all worked to keep people in line. A medieval villager did not need to witness many whippings to understand what could happen if he strayed. The memory of a neighbor's punishment was enough to discipline behavior silently, day after day. Perhaps the most striking realization, when we step back, is that punishment in the Middle Ages was never about the individual alone. It was about the community. A thief did not suffer for his crime privately, but so that others would learn. A heretic did not burn simply because of his words, but so that the town would see the flames and reaffirm its loyalty to orthodoxy. Even exile, the punishment that removed someone from sight, was about marking the boundary between belonging and exclusion. Punishment was the mirror in which a community saw itself, its fears, its values, its gods. When exploring medieval punishments, it is tempting to imagine them as uniform across Europe. But the reality is far more complex. Every kingdom, every region, even every town, often had its own customs and practices. What one village in England considered fitting for a thief, a town in Italy might handle entirely differently. To fully appreciate how punishments were carried out, we must travel across the patchwork of medieval Europe, observing the diversity of justice and cruelty. Let us begin in England, where punishments often carried a strong symbolic weight. For example, poaching on the king's land was not only a theft of game, but also an insult to royal authority. A man caught killing a deer in royal forests might be blinded or mutilated rather than executed. The message being that the forest belonged to the king and no commoner had the right to its bounty. Branding was also common in England. Thieves might be marked with an F for felony or a T for theft, seared into their flesh with a hot iron. Such marks permanently labeled them, ensuring they could never escape their past in any new community. Moving south to France, punishment frequently combined religious ritual with secular power. The church played an immense role, and penance often intertwined with corporal punishment. A blasphemer might be forced to parade barefoot through the streets, carrying a candle, followed by a public flogging. Crimes against religion were considered among the gravest, so the punishments were meant to both humiliate and purify. France also embraced execution as theatre. Heretics in particular were often burned at the stake in elaborate ceremonies designed to draw crowds from miles around. These events blended legal procedure, religious liturgy, and public entertainment, leaving a profound mark on all who attended. Across the Alps in Italy, punishments took on their own flavor, especially in the city-states. Italian cities such as Florence or Venice had reputations for both severe and inventive penalties. Venice, with its canals and bridges, often staged executions in public squares, where the body might hang over water for all to see. In Florence, the political rivalries of the ruling families meant that exile was a common punishment. Entire families could be banished, their property seized, their names blackened. For the Italian city-state, exile was as devastating as death, for it stripped people not only of their home but of their very identity. Turning eastward to Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, punishments could be particularly gruesome, reflecting both the local traditions and the influence of Roman law, which had been preserved and adapted over centuries. One striking example was the punishment of breaking on the wheel. The condemned person was tied to a large wheel, and the executioner systematically smashed their limbs with an iron bar. Sometimes the body was then woven into the spokes of the wheel and displayed on a tall post as a warning. This was especially reserved for murderers, robbers, or those who had committed crimes deemed exceptionally evil. German towns also frequently used cages suspended in the air, leaving offenders to starve while onlookers gawked at their slow demise. In Spain, punishment often reflected the intense influence of both monarchy and church. The Spanish Inquisition, though emerging later in the medieval period, epitomized the fusion of religious authority with punitive spectacle. Trials for heresy could lead to torture, confession, and eventual burning at the stake. Public autos de fe, meaning acts of faith, became ritualized punishments, drawing crowds to witness sinners punished for deviating from Catholic orthodoxy. Yet Spain, too, had more localized forms of justice. Debtors might be imprisoned indefinitely, while petty criminals could be subjected to whippings or humiliation in the stocks. Moving toward Scandinavia, the cold north brought its own harsh traditions. Exile was particularly feared here, for to be banished into the wilderness was often a death sentence in itself. In Iceland, outlawry became a formal punishment. A man declared an outlaw lost all legal protections and could be killed by anyone without consequence. His property was seized, his home destroyed, and his name tarnished. This punishment reveals the deep reliance medieval societies had on community. Without the protection of a group, survival was nearly impossible. In Eastern Europe, particularly under Byzantine influence, punishments often combined mutilation with banishment. Byzantine emperors frequently used blinding as a political tool. Rivals who might claim the throne were blinded to prevent them from ruling, since a physical imperfection was seen as disqualifying. Castration was another grim penalty, used not only to humiliate, but also to remove any dynastic threat. These punishments were calculated, sparing lives but destroying futures, ensuring power remained unchallenged while avoiding martyrdom. One fascinating aspect of medieval punishment is how class and rank influenced its application. A noble caught stealing might face imprisonment or exile, while a peasant guilty of the same crime might be hanged. Wealth allowed some to buy leniency, while the poor bore the brunt of physical punishments. The very structures of society were reinforced through these acts. The law reminded everyone of their place and punished most severely those least able to resist. Yet this imbalance sometimes bred resentment, and records tell of peasants grumbling that the wealthy escaped justice far too easily. Religious institutions also provided alternatives. The concept of sanctuary meant that a criminal who reached a church could claim protection for a limited time. During this period, negotiations might occur, and the criminal could agree to exile rather than face harsher punishment. This practice reveals how the medieval church sometimes stood as a counterbalance to secular severity, offering spaces of negotiation and mercy within a violent world. Punishments also extended beyond the body into the economic realm. Fines were common, though the ability to pay them varied dramatically. For peasants, even small fines could be devastating, stripping them of livestock or tools essential to survival. In towns, guilds imposed their own punishments on members who broke rules, often fining them or forcing them to provide free goods or labor. These penalties reinforced discipline within the craft communities, ensuring that reputation and quality were maintained. Perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval punishment was the ritual of pardon and forgiveness. Kings and lords frequently issued charters pardoning criminals, sometimes for payment, sometimes as a gesture during festivals or coronations. These acts of mercy were themselves political tools, demonstrating generosity and reinforcing loyalty. For the condemned, they could mean sudden freedom, though often at a price. For the community, they illustrated that justice was not only about punishment, but also about the ruler's power to grant life or liberty. As we consider this panorama of punishments across Europe, we begin to see how deeply embedded they were in medieval society. They were not random cruelties, though cruelty was abundant. They were deliberate, symbolic acts rooted in law, religion, and custom. Each punishment reflected the fears and values of the community that carried it out. Whether it was the wheel in Germany, the stake in France, the ducking stool in England, or outlawry in Iceland, every act carried meaning. To the medieval mind, punishment was not merely about retribution. It was about order. It was a visible reminder that sin and crime could not go unchecked, that the community had boundaries which could not be crossed. Even in their brutality, punishments served as glue holding societies together, reinforcing hierarchies, traditions, and belief in divine justice. And yet, one must also imagine the human side of these stories. The trembling thief awaiting the gallows, the woman strapped to the ducking stool, shivering in icy water, the noble blinded in a Byzantine palace, stumbling through darkness for the rest of his days. These were not abstract lessons, but lives shattered, families broken, communities scarred. The history of punishment in the Middle Ages is not only about the systems that enforce them, but also about the countless individuals who endured their pain. By now, we've seen the breadth of punishments that medieval societies devised. But to truly grasp their impact, we must step away from lists of methods and instead walk through the experience of living under the constant shadow of justice. For ordinary men and women, punishment was not an abstract notion tucked away in law books. It was visible, ever-present, and meant to be unforgettable. The medieval world was a stage, and punishment was among its most powerful performances. Imagine yourself waking in a bustling medieval town. The marketplace is filled with the smells of baking bread, the noise of merchants hawking goods, and the shuffle of hooves on cobbled streets. But then a bell tolls. Heads turn. A crowd begins to gather. Word spreads quickly. A thief is being brought to justice. Everyone knows where to go. The central square, where the stocks stand, where the gallows rise stark against the sky. For the townspeople, punishment is as much part of life as fairs or festivals. Children are led by their parents to watch, learning early what fate awaits the lawless. Punishment in this sense served as a public education system, one not written in books, but carved into human memory. The sight of a man's ear being nailed to a post or a woman being whipped at the carts. Tale burned itself into minds far more vividly than any sermon. It told the community, disobedience has consequences, and those consequences will be borne in front of your neighbors. Shame, more than pain, was often the tool that kept order. But punishment was not only about the individual criminal. It was also about reaffirming the collective power of the community and, above all, the ruler. Kings, lords, and magistrates needed to demonstrate that their word mattered. The law was, in many respects, a performance of authority. To let crime go unanswered would be to invite chaos. And so punishments became rituals where power was reaffirmed through blood, suffering, and display. Take, for instance, the punishment of public executions. These were not hurried or hidden affairs. They were meticulously staged. In London, Tyburn became synonymous with executions, and the route to the gallows was an event in itself. Condemned prisoners were paraded through the streets, often in carts, jeered or pitied by the crowds. Some prayed loudly, hoping to redeem their souls. Others spat curses, defiant to the last. When the noose tightened and the body kicked in the air, thousands watched. The message was unmistakable. The state's power extended even to life and death. These events also took on the character of festivities. Merchants sold food and drink. Ballads were composed about the crimes and punishments, sold as cheap broadsheet. Executioners themselves gained notoriety, becoming figures of both fear and fascination. The spectacle of justice blurred into entertainment, shaping how communities bonded over shared experiences of dread and relief. Punishments also functioned on a more intimate, psychological level. Fear of pain and humiliation guided behavior as effectively as religious teaching. To be flogged publicly meant that your body became a text others could read. Scars, brands, or missing limbs told stories of past transgressions. These marks followed individuals for life, making reintegration into society nearly impossible. Punishment, therefore, was not just an event, but a lifelong sentence of social exclusion. Yet, there was an inherent tension in this system. On one hand, punishments were meant to deter, but on the other, they risked creating sympathy for the condemned. Crowds sometimes turned restless. If they felt an execution was unjust, they might riot or attempt to rescue the prisoner. Authorities knew this and worked hard to control the narrative. Priests often accompanied the condemned, urging repentance and framing the punishment as necessary for the salvation of the sinner's soul. The ritual was carefully designed to remind onlookers that justice was aligned with divine will, not merely human cruelty. We must also understand the deep role of religion in shaping punishments. Medieval people believed that earthly justice mirrored heavenly justice. To burn a heretic at the stake was not simply about punishing a crime. It was a visible sign that the soul's corruption had to be purged by fire. To dunk a suspected witch or scald into icy water symbolized the cleansing of sin. Punishment was theology made flesh. For the guilty, suffering was framed as a form of penance. For the innocent, enduring punishment with dignity might even be seen as saintly. This religious overlay also helps justify punishments that today seem excessive or inhumane. If suffering on earth brought one closer to salvation, then even torture could be reinterpreted as a chance for redemption. Authorities leaned heavily on this belief, convincing themselves and the populace that cruelty had a divine purpose. It blurred the line between justice and ritual sacrifice, between discipline and spectacle. The architecture of punishment shaped daily life to every town had its instruments, whipping posts, stocks, pillories, and sometimes gallows. These structures were not hidden away. They stood prominently, often near marketplaces or churches. They were part of the landscape, ever reminding people of the consequences of sin. Imagine walking past the pillory on your way to buy bread, knowing that at any moment someone might be locked there for public ridicule. Such ever-present symbols embedded fear into the very streets people walked daily. Children grew up under these reminders. For them, punishment was part of life's rhythm. They might toss rotten fruit at a prisoner in the stocks, laugh at his misery, and carry those images into adulthood as moral lessons. Punishment was education through cruelty, reinforcing social order not through books but through lived experience. Yet amid this severity, there were also moments of unexpected mercy. Medieval justice was not uniformly brutal. Sometimes, instead of losing a hand, A thief might be sentenced to service in a noble's household. Sometimes, a flogging was reduced, or a prisoner was released on holy days. The possibility of pardon, however slim, added a complex layer to the drama of justice. It was not only about fear, but about the ruler's ability to show mercy, reinforcing their image as not merely tyrants, but guardians of both punishment and grace. We must also consider the cultural memory created by punishment. When a woman was drowned as a scold, or when a man was broken on the wheel, those acts did not vanish once the crowd dispersed. They were retold around fires, whispered in taverns, remembered in families. Stories of punishments became cautionary tales that endured across generations. A child might hear of the thief who lost his hand 50 years ago, and the story would shape their understanding of justice long after the event. Punishment, therefore, extended beyond its moment, seeping into the cultural imagination of entire communities. Punishments also reflected gender differences. Men and women were not always treated alike. Women accused of gossiping or being quarrelsome were more likely to face the cucking stool or ducking pond. Punishments that specifically targeted their voices and bodies in ways meant to humiliate. Men accused of cowardice in battle might face shaming rituals designed to question their masculinity. These punishments reinforced gender roles as much as they enforced laws, shaping medieval expectations of how men and women should behave. There were also class-specific humiliations. A noble might be spared the whip, but forced into exile. His shame carried not through physical scars, but through the loss of honor and title. A peasant, lacking wealth or standing, bore the lash, the brand, or the stocks. This disparity reinforced the rigid class structures of medieval life, showing not only that the law was uneven, but also that punishment itself was a tool for maintaining hierarchy at its core. Medieval punishment was a negotiation between fear, order, and spectacle. It was a system that bound communities together, even as it brutalized individuals. To live in the Middle Ages was to live constantly aware that one's actions could end not only in fines or imprisonment, but in scars, mutilation, and death, often carried out in front of the people you knew best. When we step back, we realize that punishment was not simply about crime. It was about power. It was about shaping behavior, teaching lessons, and reinforcing the order of a society where stability was fragile and rebellion always simmered beneath the surface. Medieval punishments may seem barbaric today, but to those who lived through them, they were part of the very fabric of life, as essential and inevitable as the ringing of church bells or the tolling of the market bell. To understand the full scope of medieval punishments, one cannot confine the story to the open squares of villages or the bustling marketplaces of towns. Justice in the Middle Ages unfolded in many arenas, each with its own rituals, rules, and peculiarities, while peasants bore the brunt of public humiliation and harsh corporal penalties. The castles, monasteries, and cloisters of Europe witnessed their own distinct systems of control. Punishments were never uniform. They were tailored to class, role, and institution. To live as a serf, a knight, or a monk meant to endure different kinds of discipline, each one designed not only to punish, but to reinforce the values of the environment in which you lived. Step first inside the towering stone walls of a medieval castle. Here, the law was embodied by the Lord, who ruled with near absolute authority over his lands. In many ways, the castle functioned as its own court and prison. A nobleman accused of disobedience, betrayal, or cowardice in battle might not be thrown into the same stocks as a peasant. Instead, his punishment was often crafted to strike at his sense of pride and honor, which was valued more than flesh. The greatest humiliation for a knight was not the whip, but the stripping of his titles and the destruction of his coat of arms. The symbols that defined him, his heraldic shield, his family crests, could be publicly broken before him, rendering him dishonored in the eyes of all. For a noble whose identity was tied entirely to lineage and valor, such a punishment could be worse than death. Yet physical penalties were not absent in castles. Dungeons and oubliettes, the infamous forgotten holes, were realities of medieval justice. Prisoners might be lowered into a pit with no stairway out, left in darkness, with only scraps of food tossed down occasionally. Time itself became the punishment, days blending into nights without sunlight or human contact. To die in such a place was to vanish from memory, an end as symbolic as it was literal. Some were chained in cells so small they could not stand fully upright, their backs bent for years until they became hunchbacked specters of themselves. Castles were also sites of martial discipline. Knights and soldiers who disobeyed orders, fled from combat, or dishonored their lord might face brutal consequences. Flogging was common within military camps, as was running the gauntlet of punishment, where the guilty soldier was forced to pass between rows of comrades who struck him with sticks, whips, or fists. Such punishments were designed not only to inflict pain, but to restore collective order within the ranks. To fight as one meant to discipline as one, and every soldier understood that his loyalty was bound by fear as much as honor. Move from the castle to the monastery, and the character of punishment changes. Monks and nuns were bound by vows, and while their lives were dedicated to prayer, silence, and obedience, they were not immune to transgression. The cloister had its own justice system, one rooted in penance and spiritual correction. For breaking vows of silence, a monk might be ordered to lie prostrate on the cold stone floor of the chapel during prayers, visible to his brethren as a living example of humility. For neglecting his duties or speaking out of turn, he might be given extra fasts, reduced meals, or sleepless vigils. Hunger, fatigue, and shame became the instruments of discipline in holy spaces. Yet monasteries could also be surprisingly harsh. A monk who attempted to flee the cloister might be confined in chains or locked away in a small, barren cell. Some records even describe monks being whipped by their superiors as a means of enforcing obedience. Such punishments were rationalized as acts of love, intended to bring the errant soul back to God's path through suffering. The paradox of medieval piety lay in the belief that pain could cleanse, that discipline of the body purified the soul. For nuns, punishments often targeted their communal and spiritual life. A nun found guilty of disobedience might be separated from her sisters, forced to sit apart in the chapel or eat alone in silence. Social isolation in a world built on shared prayer and work was a heavy burden. In more serious cases, disobedient nuns might be confined within their convent walls, denied any contact with the outside world, a punishment that blurred into lifelong imprisonment. Even within monasteries, hierarchy mattered. An abbot or abbess might face censure from higher church authorities, but they were rarely subjected to the humiliations inflicted on ordinary monks or nuns. Just as, in castles and towns, medieval punishment reflected the layers of social order, always reinforcing the structures of authority that defined the age. Beyond the cloister, the church also wielded its own public punishments. Ecclesiastical courts tried crimes ranging from blasphemy to heresy, and while they often emphasized penance pilgrimages, fasting, or, wearing penitential garments, they could also deliver offenders to secular authorities for harsher penalties. A man accused of heresy might first be paraded barefoot through the streets, clothed in a rough tunic marked with symbols of his sin, before being handed over to the civil courts for burning at the stake. Here we see the collaboration between sacred and secular justice, each reinforcing the other's authority in towns and villages. The presence of ecclesiastical punishment added another layer of fear. To be punished by the church was not only a matter of physical pain or humiliation, but of eternal consequence. A person could be excommunicated, cut off from the sacraments, and effectively cast out of the spiritual life of the community. In an age where salvation was the central concern, such a punishment could be more terrifying than any whip or dungeon. What makes these different systems, monastery, church, so fascinating is how they reveal the adaptability of medieval punishment. Justice was never one's. Instead, it was crafted to strike where it hurt most, whether through shame, hunger, pain, or dishonor. To a knight, the loss of honor was unbearable. To a monk, isolation was crushing. To a peasant, public flogging was ruinous. Each punishment targeted not just the body, but the very identity of the person, ensuring that the lesson was seared into their life. And always, at every level of society, punishment was visible. Whether in the public square, the cloister's chapel, or the castle's hall, others were meant to see, to learn, to fear. Punishment was a language, spoken in scars and rituals, through chains and silence, through shame and spectacle. It shaped the rhythms of medieval life, ensuring that no one, from the humblest serf to the most powerful noble, could forget that they lived under a system where justice was both a threat and a performance. The reach of medieval justice extended far beyond the monastery cloister or the lord's castle. Across Europe, justice had to be carried into the towns and villages where daily life unfolded, where disputes over land, theft, or insult erupted constantly. It was here, in the open spaces of communities, that feudal courts, manorial courts, and even traveling judges sought to impose order on a world that might otherwise dissolve into endless feuds. Punishment in these spaces was not only about enforcing laws, but about knitting together communities by reminding everyone of the fragile balance of peace. Picture a manorial court convening on a summer's morning. Villagers gather before the manor house, summoned to witness the proceedings. The lord or his appointed steward presides, seated at a high table, while local disputes are brought forward. These courts dealt with the small yet constant frictions of daily rural life, accusations of trespassing livestock, debts unpaid, slander between neighbors. For such cases, punishment was rarely as spectacular as the burnings and beheadings reserved for great crimes, but it was still public and still potent. A man found guilty of stealing firewood from the Lord's forest might be fined heavily or forced to surrender tools. A woman who spread false rumors might be ordered to carry a stone through the village or stand before her neighbors with a sign declaring her crime. The punishments of courts often emphasized restoration and humiliation rather than destruction. To live in a village meant to be bound to one's neighbors, and justice sought to heal breaches while maintaining authority. Yet the possibility of corporal punishment always loomed, for when theft or repeated defiance occurred, the lash or the stocks were never far away. A young man caught poaching deer, a grave crime against the Lord's rights, might be flogged, branded, or, in extreme cases, hanged as a warning to all beyond the manor. Larger courts convened to deal with crimes that spilled beyond the authority of a single lord. These could be county courts or sessions overseen by royal officials, particularly in the later Middle Ages when kings sought to extend their reach. In these spaces, punishments grew harsher, for they had to make examples of offenders across wide regions. Here we see the rise of the gallows, erected not in a hidden place, but along well-traveled roads where every passerby could see bodies swinging in the wind. Executions were staged events filled with ritual. The condemned might be forced to confess publicly, to beg forgiveness, and then mount the scaffold before a crowd of hundreds. Traveling judges, sometimes called justices in Eyre in England, brought with them not only authority but also spectacle. When such officials arrived in a town, it meant that justice itself had come on tour, carrying with it the drama of trials and punishments. These events could last days, as multiple cases were heard, verdicts rendered, and sentences carried out one after another. It was as much performance as it was law, a reminder that the king or the realm had power even in distant corners. To watch a neighbor whipped, branded, or executed under the eye of royal authority was to see the crown itself in action. Regional variations made these systems uneven across Europe. In France, for example, the influence of Roman law persisted, shaping more formalized procedures, while in England the common law system was taking root, where precedent and custom weighed heavily. In German territories, local codes often gave great latitude to lords, who could mete out justice as they pleased, leading to wide differences in punishment from one region to another. A thief in one village might be fined. In another, he might lose a hand. Punishments also reflected cultural ideas about crime and sin. In Scandinavian regions, outlawry, a punishment where one was declared beyond the protection of the law, was common. To be outlawed meant that anyone could kill you without consequence, and it severed all bonds of community. In Italy, where city-states thrived, punishment often took on a theatrical quality, with criminals paraded through the piazza, sometimes with painted faces or absurd costumes meant to exaggerate their shame. Such variations remind us that medieval punishment was never a single system, but a mosaic of traditions, each shaped by local history and belief. One striking feature of these courts was how often punishments involved the body, itself as a canvas of justice. Branding was widespread, particularly for repeat offenders. A thief might be marked on the cheek or forehead with a hot iron, ensuring that his crime was written permanently on his skin. The scar became both a punishment and a warning to others. In some regions, mutilation was favored, the loss of a hand for theft, of an ear or nose for lesser offenses. These punishments disfigured as well as disciplined, reducing the criminal's ability to move through society unnoticed. They bore their crime like a permanent badge, yet not all punishments were violent. Fines were extremely common, especially for those with means to pay. Wealthy offenders might escape physical pain by surrendering coin, livestock, or land. This disparity between rich and poor meant that punishment was always unevenly distributed. For the peasant with nothing, the stocks or lash awaited. For the wealthy merchant, money could buy freedom, even when guilt was clear. Justice, then as now, was tilted by class. The traveling judges and larger courts also reinforced the ritual of oaths. In a world where written records were scarce, swearing an oath before God and community was itself a form of justice. False oaths were met with harsh punishments, for they undermined the entire system. A man convicted of perjury might be forced to stand barefoot on sharp stones, hold a heavy weight during Mass, or face public whipping. The punishment was not simply for lying, but for desecrating the bond that held medieval society together. The word given under God's eye. It is worth noting how often medieval punishments were meant to be communal experiences. Villagers were summoned to watch, townspeople pressed into squares to witness. Silence fell as the sentence was pronounced, and then the act itself, whether the crack of the whip, the hiss of branding iron, or the drop of the gallows, was performed before all. This spectacle reinforced not only fear but also solidarity. Watching another's suffering was meant to teach obedience, but it also reminded communities that they lived together under shared rules. The memory of punishments lingered long after the event. Children who watched a thief whipped would carry that image for life, their own behavior subtly shaped by the scarred bodies around them. Markets remembered where hangings took place. Fields remembered where gibbets stood. Justice was written into the very geography of towns and countrysides, each execution site, pillory, or whipping post marking the landscape as much as churches or marketplaces did dot as traveling judges and feudal courts spread across the land. Medieval people came to expect justice not as a private negotiation, but as a public act, filled with ritual, spectacle, and terror. The unevenness of it, softer for some, harsher for others, did not diminish its impact. Instead, it reinforced the reality that to live in the Middle Ages was to live under constant awareness of authority. Whether that authority was a lord in his hall, a monk in his cloister, or a judge riding into town with the power of the king behind him. In the end, medieval punishments were less about fairness than about control. They were tools for maintaining order, suppressing defiance, and embedding fear in the collective memory of a community. That fear lingered long after the lash marks healed or the gallows were taken down, shaping behavior, binding communities, and reminding everyone that justice in the Middle Ages was a drama they could not escape. If punishments in medieval villages and courts left scars upon the body, the deeper wounds were often carved into the mind. Fear was one of the most enduring instruments of medieval justice. To live in those times was to live under an ever-present awareness that transgressions, even small ones, could bring shame, pain, or death. The law was not a distant concept hidden in dusty texts. It was a constant shadow embodied in the stocks in the town square, the gallows on the hill, or the stories whispered by parents to warn their children against folly. Fear worked quietly, weaving itself into the rhythms of everyday life. A peasant walking to market might pass a set of stocks where someone had once sat, shivering in the rain while villagers jeered. A farmer might travel past a gibbet where a corpse, long since reduced to bone, still swayed in the wind, reminding all who passed that theft or rebellion would meet a grim end. Even when no punishment was actively unfolding, the memory of it hung heavy in the air. These reminders were like silent sermons, reinforcing obedience through the imagination as much as through the eye. For many, fear was cultivated by the church, just as much as by secular rulers. Sin was not only a matter of spiritual damnation, but also of earthly discipline. Priests preached about eternal flames, while manorial courts imposed temporal penalties. The two systems overlapped, creating a network of dread that reached into every corner of life. To blaspheme against God risked excommunication, a form of spiritual banishment that was itself a punishment as severe as death. Without the church, one was cut off from burial, sacraments, and the community itself. This intertwining of spiritual and earthly fear created a society where stepping out of line seemed unthinkable. Yet fear was not always enough to ensure obedience. When crimes were serious, suspicion heavy, or confessions absent, medieval justice turned to torture. To us, torture seems the most horrifying of punishments, a grotesque violation of human dignity. But to the medieval mind, it was a tool grim, yes, but seen as sometimes necessary to uncover truth. Confessions were highly prized, for they were viewed as cleansing both to the soul of the accused and to the integrity of the court. If a man or woman denied guilt under oath but suspicions remained strong, torture might be introduced as a way of pressing truth from reluctant lips. The settings for torture were as varied as the crimes. In some towns, chambers were set aside beneath castles or within city halls. Dark, cold, and narrow, these spaces amplified the psychological terror of the instruments within. A person accused might be dragged into such a chamber, the heavy door slamming shut behind them, the smell of iron and damp stone filling the air. Torches cast flickering light on devices designed to stretch, crush, or pierce. The sight alone was enough to break many spirits before a finger was laid upon them. The rack remains one of the most infamous medieval devices. To be tied hand and foot, then slowly stretched until joints dislocated and muscles tore, was agony beyond description. Yet the purpose was rarely to kill. It was to extract a confession, to demonstrate the power of the authorities, and to return the victim to the world broken but compliant. Other devices, like the strapado, relied on suspension. Victims were hoisted by ropes tied to their wrists, arms wrenched behind their backs, and then dropped suddenly, their shoulders often dislocating in the process. Some tortures were more symbolic. The thumbscrew, a small device, crushed digits slowly, while the boot to frame tightened around the leg, splintered bones with iron wedges. The variety of methods reveals not only cruelty, but also creativity unsettling. Ingenuity directed toward the infliction of pain. And yet, these were not always carried out in total secrecy. Sometimes the threat of torture was displayed publicly, with instruments exhibited in markets or left visible in courthouses to remind all of their potential use. Psychological pressure was also a kind of torture. Accused persons were left in darkness, deprived of food, or told false stories of others' confessions. Interrogators would bring in witnesses, sometimes bribed, to confront the accused. The line between mental and physical torture blurred, for both aimed to break resistance. In the end, the greatest cruelty was not the pain itself, but the demand to surrender one's truth, to confess even when innocence remained. Despite the grim reality, torture was not universally applied. Its use was restricted in some regions, and by the late Middle Ages, formal rules began to appear that sought to limit excess. In many courts, torture could not be used unless there was already strong evidence of guilt. Confessions obtained under torture had to be repeated freely afterward, without duress, to be valid. These restrictions did little to ease the suffering of victims, but they revealed the uneasy conscience of a system that relied on methods it also feared could be unjust. For ordinary people, the specter of torture was less immediate than the punishments seen in daily life, but stories spread quickly. Tales of victims stretched on racks, of witches crushed beneath stones, of heretics burned at the stake. These circulated by word of mouth and sermon, magnified with each retelling. Such stories carried the weight of legend, merging fact and rumor into cautionary tales. Parents would use them to frighten children into obedience, just as rulers used them to frighten subjects into submission. Fear extended further still into the imagination of the afterlife. For a medieval peasant, earthly punishments were terrifying, but hell was worse. The two worked in tandem. The lash could be endured, but eternal fire could not. Thus, confessing before death, accepting punishment willingly, was encouraged, even admired. The condemned who mounted the scaffold calmly, acknowledging their sins, were sometimes seen as models of piety. To resist or deny guilt was not only dangerous, but spiritually perilous. Communities lived in the shadow of these punishments, and that shadow became a form of social glue. The constant presence of fear meant that disputes were often settled before they reached courts, through negotiation, compensation, or apology. Better to resolve matters quietly than to risk public humiliation, mutilation, or worse. In this sense, the brutality of the system paradoxically encouraged peace. Villagers policed themselves, aware that a single wrong step could spiral into the lash or the noose. It is here that we see the most haunting aspect of medieval punishment: its ability to control not just bodies, but minds. The fear of punishment did not vanish when the lash was put away or the gallows dismantled. It lived inside people, shaping behavior long before a crime was committed. That internalized fear was perhaps the most effective punishment of all, for it required no ropes, no whips, no scaffolds. It lived quietly, silently, in every decision to obey. As the Middle Ages wore on, torture and public punishment began to be questioned, but the cultural memory of fear remained. Generations grew up in its shadow, carrying the lessons of pain into the fabric of their communities. To us, the tools and practices of medieval punishment seem monstrous. Yet for those who lived under them, they were part of the natural order, as inevitable as the changing of the seasons or the turning of the harvest wheel. The stage was now set for the most extreme punishments of Arthur, executions that burned themselves into collective memory, where fear, ritual, and spectacle combined in acts that defined medieval justice in its most terrible form. If fear and torture were the silent whispers of medieval justice, execution was its thunderous roar. It was the ultimate punishment, the one that stripped away not only freedom but life itself. In a society where survival was already precarious, to be executed was more than an end. It was a performance designed to teach, terrify, and remind everyone of the thin line between obedience and ruin. Executions in the Middle Ages were rarely private affairs. They were spectacles, orchestrated with precision to attract the largest possible crowd. When someone was condemned, word spread quickly. Market gossip carried the news, church bells sometimes told, and villagers from miles around would gather to witness what was promised to be a display of both justice and power. The condemned did not simply vanish into a dungeon or face their fate unseen. Instead, they were paraded before their peers, elevated to the center of attention in their final hours. The choice of location was deliberate. Gallows were often erected on hills or crossroads, places impossible to miss. Their visibility was crucial, for they stood not only as instruments of death, but as monuments of authority. Travelers entering a town might be greeted by the sight of dangling bodies, left deliberately to rot in the wind. A warning to all strangers that this community enforced its laws with unflinching severity. Among the most common forms of execution was hanging. It was simple, effective, and accessible, requiring little more than rope and wood. Yet even within this simplicity, variations existed. Some hangings were swift, the condemned dropping and breaking their necks in an instant. Others were slower, with the victim struggling for breath, legs kicking until life ebbed away. In both cases, the message was clear: theft, rebellion, or murder would be met with finality. for those guilty of more serious crimes or crimes considered affronts to the moral order, executions took on more elaborate forms. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics and witches, crimes seen not just as threats to society but to the soul itself. To stand surrounded by flames, body consumed while chants rose from the crowd, was a death meant to cleanse through fire. The symbolism was inescapable. Earthly punishment echoed the eternal hellfire awaiting unrepentant sinners. Decapitation, meanwhile, was often considered a more honorable death, particularly for nobles. The axe or the sword provided a quick end, at least when wielded by a skilled executioner. But even here, horror lurked. An unsteady hand could mean repeated blows, each swing compounding the agony and humiliation. Crowds sometimes jeered at botched executions, their shouts mingling with the cries of the condemned. The executioner himself was a strange figure in medieval society. Feared, despised, yet necessary, he lived on the fringes of respectability. His hands delivered justice, but his presence carried a taint. Some executioners inherited the role through family lines, while others were forced into the position as punishment themselves. They often received privileges, wages, food, or lodging, but were shunned by neighbors who feared contamination by association. To be touched by the executioner was to carry a stain, even if his blade served the law. What made executions particularly chilling was not just the method, but the theater surrounding them. The condemned were sometimes allowed to speak before their deaths. A final confession, a plea for mercy, or a proclamation of innocence could shape how the crowd remembered the event. In many cases, priests encouraged the condemned to die penitent, reminding all present of the unity between earthly justice and divine will. Those who died bravely, acknowledging guilt, were sometimes respected. Those who defied their fate, cursing their judges or proclaiming innocence, were remembered as defiant martyrs. Communities treated executions as communal events. Vendors sold food, children were brought to watch, and people jostled for a good view as though attending a festival. The mixture of entertainment and dread reveals a paradox at the heart of medieval justice. These spectacles were meant to inspire fear and obedience, but they also fed a hunger for drama. For many peasants, whose lives were defined by repetition and toil, the execution was one of the few public spectacles available. Mingling horror with fascination, the treatment of the body after execution carried its own weight of symbolism. Thieves might be left hanging, their corpses swaying until decay forced them down. More serious offenders could be quartered, their limbs nailed to city gates or displayed along roads as warnings. Heads might be impaled on spikes, glaring down at those who dared to imagine rebellion. The body was not merely destroyed, it was transformed into a message, an object lesson, a signpost of authority carved into human flesh. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of executions was how ordinary they became. In cities, public hangings could occur regularly, their frequency numbing the horror and embedding it into the rhythm of life. In smaller villages, the rarity of such events gave them heightened impact, their memory lingering for generations. The execution became part of the folklore of the place, retold in whispers by firesides. The man who swung from the gallows, the woman who burned while cursing the crowd, the boy who watched and never forgot. Children grew up beneath these shadows, learning lessons more visceral than any sermon could offer. They saw firsthand what disobedience looked like when punished to the extreme. In this way, executions became an extension of education, forming part of the social contract that bound communities together. Fear was not abstract. It was lived, seen, and remembered in the trembling of bodies and the silence that followed a final cry. As time passed, some began to question the effectiveness of such brutality. Did fear truly prevent crime, or did it merely breed resentment and cruelty? The debate would simmer into the later centuries, but during the Middle Ages, executions remained essential to the functioning of justice. They reinforced the idea that law was not a distant concept, but a living force, carried out in blood and fire for all to see. Executions were the punctuation marks of medieval life. Exclamation points hammered into the daily rhythm of toil, prayer, and survival. They were moments when the veil of routine lifted and the stark power of authority blazed forth, undeniable and unforgettable. And yet, even in their horror, they revealed something profoundly human, the need to make meaning out of death. To the authorities, executions were tools of control. To the church, they were moments of spiritual reckoning. To the people, they were stories to be retold, lessons to be remembered, and spectacles to be witnessed. Death was not hidden, it was public, shared, and woven into the fabric of medieval existence, with the ultimate punishments laid bare. We can now turn to the broader consequences. Beyond the scaffold and the stake, what did this culture of fear, pain, and public death do to the hearts and minds of those who lived beneath it? When we step back from the whips, the chains, the gallows, and the flames, it becomes clear that medieval punishments were never just about the individual. They were about society itself, about shaping behavior, cementing authority, and weaving fear into the very air people breathed. To understand what these punishments really meant, we need to explore not just the pain of the condemned, but the ripples that spread outward, touching every villager, every family, and every generation that lived beneath the looming shadow of the law. Fear was the visible thread running through daily life in the Middle Ages. For peasants, survival already hung by a fragile thread-felled harvests. Disease, war, and poverty could ruin a family overnight. Add to this the constant reminder that a wrong step might lead not only to fines or shame, but to a flogging in front of neighbors. Or worse, the scaffold, and you begin to see how punishment worked as a quiet enforcer. People were not simply bound by custom or religion, they were bound by the certainty that disobedience would not go. Unnoticed, this fear shaped behavior in countless ways. The marketplace, for instance, was a hub of both trade and suspicion. Sellers knew that dishonest weights could bring the pillory, while buyers worried about being accused of theft. The presence of punishments hovering in the imagination turned ordinary exchanges into moments of caution. Trust had to be earned, because betrayal carried the risk of public humiliation. In villages, disputes between neighbors were often settled quickly, lest they escalate into accusations that brought the law's heavy hand down upon both parties. Children, too, were raised within this atmosphere. From their earliest days, they saw punishment not as an abstract concept, but as a living reality. A boy might watch his father tied to the stocks for drunkenness, or a girl might whisper about a neighbor branded as a thief. These images carved themselves into young minds, creating a sense that justice was not distant but immediate, embodied in wounds, scars, and reputations destroyed. For many, the first lessons about right and wrong were taught not by parents or priests, but by the living examples of punishment on display in their communities at the same time. Punishment was about control, about ensuring that people not only feared crime, but also respected the structures of power. Kings, nobles, and lords used justice as a tool to reinforce their dominance. A thief caught stealing from a peasant might receive a beating, but stealing from a lord's storehouse could bring death. The message was clear. The higher the status of the victim, the harsher the consequence. Law was not blind. It was weighted, tilted toward the preservation of privilege and order. The church, too, played a profound role in shaping how punishments were perceived. For medieval Christians, crime was not merely a social wrong, but a sin, an act against God's order. Punishments therefore carried a moral dimension. To be whipped or pilloried was to be corrected, not only by human authority, but by divine will. Public penance, such as wearing sackcloth or confessing publicly, blurred the line between legal and spiritual punishment. The soul and the body were intertwined, and justice sought to cleanse both through visible suffering. This intertwining of law and religion created an atmosphere where punishment was seen as necessary, even righteous. When a heretic burned at the stake, the crowd did not simply witness a death, they saw the triumph of faith over corruption, the defense of belief against the chaos of doubt. When a thief swung from the gallows, it was a lesson that God's commandments, "Thou shalt not steal," were not empty words, but rules enforced with fire and rope. And yet, beneath this order, tension simmered. Fear could keep people obedient, but it could also breed resentment. Families of the condemned sometimes cursed the authorities, whispering that justice had been unfair or too harsh. In taverns and behind closed doors, some muttered that lords and judges punished the poor while excusing the powerful. Though few dared to speak openly, the memory of injustice lingered, shaping attitudes toward authority in ways subtle but lasting. The psychological weight of punishment extended beyond those directly involved. Entire communities bore its mark. When a man was executed, his wife and children carried the shame for years, sometimes for life. Neighbors might avoid them, fearing contamination by association, or gossip might follow them like a shadow. Punishment was thus not limited to the condemned, but radiated outward, reshaping social bonds, friendships, and alliances. Even the physical spaces of towns bore the imprint of punishment. The gallows hill, the stocks by the market square, the pillory outside the church. These landmarks reminded people daily of the consequences of disobedience. They became part of the landscape of memory, places whispered about, places children avoided after dark. Justice was not hidden behind walls. It stood in the center of life, etched into wood, stone, and the collective imagination. Over time, these practices created a culture of caution where conformity became survival. People learned to police not only their own actions, but each other's. Accusations could be deadly, and suspicion became a quiet weapon. A neighbor's careless word might place someone before a judge, and so communities lived in a delicate balance of cooperation and mistrust. This constant awareness of punishment's presence shaped medieval society as deeply as religion, war, or famine. Yet, for all its brutality, punishment also reflected the deep human need for order. In a world where chaos was never far away, armies might raid, disease might strike, or harvests might fail, law and justice offered a kind of stability. They reassured people that wrongs would be answered, that sin would be punished, and that the world, however harsh, still operated under rules. Even when punishments seemed cruel, they provided a framework that allowed communities to function, to trust that someone, somewhere, was watching and judging in this way. The punishments of the Middle Ages were more than acts of cruelty or discipline. They were the scaffolding of medieval life, holding together a fragile order in a world where survival itself was uncertain. They left scars, both physical and psychological, that shaped not just individuals, but entire generations. And even as the centuries turned and justice evolved, their echoes remained woven into the stories, fears, and memories of those who lived in their shadow. The question, then, is not simply what punishments looked like, but what they did. They carved obedience, instilled fear, reinforced authority, and created a rhythm of life where justice was visible, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. They were the invisible hand guiding behavior, the silent partner to prayer and toil, the reminder that power was always watching. But as with all systems built on fear, there were cracks. People began to wonder if mercy had a place in justice, if reform might be as powerful as the lash. Slowly, new ideas would begin to stir, setting the stage for change in later centuries. Yet, in the heart of the Middle Ages, punishment was not about rehabilitation. It was about control, and it was written in blood, fire, and pain. If punishment in the Middle Ages was the tool that shaped daily life, it was also a mirror that reflected society itself. To understand the full scope of how medieval justice operated, we have to look at how punishment varied across the layers of hierarchy, because not everyone stood equal before the law. A noble, a peasant, a merchant, and a monk might all commit the same crime, but their outcomes could be drastically different. A reminder that law was not an impartial scale, but a carefully weighted instrument in the hands of power. For peasants, punishment was direct, harsh, and immediate. Their lives were already precarious, bound to the soil they worked and the lords they served. A stolen loaf of bread, a quarrel that turned violent, or a drunken brawl in the tavern could all lead to swift consequences. Stocks, pillories, floggings, and fines were common. And while these might seem mild compared to the more dramatic executions of the age, they carried lasting consequences. A peasant beaten in the square was not just wounded in body, he was marked in the eyes of his neighbors, branded by shame. For those living in tightly knit villages, reputation was survival, and a punishment in public could sever trust, friendships, and even opportunities for marriage or trade. Merchants and townsfolk, who held more wealth and influence than peasants, often faced punishments that struck at their livelihoods. A dishonest trader might find his goods seized or his right to sell revoked. City authorities, keen to preserve order in bustling markets, used punishments that protected commerce as much as morality. A merchant, branded as untrustworthy, could see his fortunes collapse overnight, his customers evaporating and his family suffering. In cities, the fear was not only of pain, but of ruin, the destruction of a reputation built painstakingly over years. Nobles, however, occupied a very different position. Their crimes, when punished, often resulted in outcomes cushioned by their status. Rarely would a noble be subjected to the humiliation of the stocks or the lash. Their dignity, tied to the very fabric of feudal society, was considered too important to tarnish. Instead, nobles might face imprisonment in a castle, exile, or the confiscation of land. These punishments struck at wealth and influence rather than the body, reinforcing the idea that noble blood carried protections denied to commoners. Yet, when nobles committed treason or defied the crown, the consequences could be spectacular. Executions of highborn rebels were grand affairs, staged to remind all of the king's power. Heads on spikes above castle gates or corpses, displayed after battles, sent messages, not only to the guilty, but to every noble tempted to challenge authority. The clergy formed yet another class with its own system of justice. The church operated its own courts, and clergy accused of crimes were often tried within ecclesiastical systems rather than secular ones. This meant that punishments for priests, monks, and nuns often focused on penance fasting, pilgrimage, or confinement within a monastery. While this may sound merciful compared to the lash or gallows, it carried its own weight. A priest forbidden from preaching, a monk isolated from his brethren, or a nun disgraced before her convent endured punishments that cut at their spiritual identity. At times, however, even clergy could not escape harsher penalties. Heresy, above all, was treated with severity, and here the church turned to fire as its chosen instrument. To burn the body was to purify the soul, or so the reasoning went. And so the punishment of heretics became some of the most infamous spectacles of the medieval period. This unequal distribution of punishment reveals much about how medieval society functioned. Justice was not blind, it was deeply entangled with status, wealth, and influence. The same act of theft could lead to a flogging for a peasant, bankruptcy for a merchant, and exile for a noble. Each punishment reinforced the structure of society, reminding people of their place and the dangers of overstepping it. But the differences did not stop with class. Geography, too, shaped justice. A thief in England might face the gallows, while in France he might be sent to the galleys. In Germanic lands, mutilations, such as the removal of a hand or an ear, remained more common, while in Italy, city-states often relied on elaborate fines. These variations reflected the patchwork nature of medieval Europe, where laws evolved under local traditions, feudal customs, and the influence of both secular rulers and the church. What was considered a fair punishment in one town could be seen as excessive or lenient in another. Despite these differences, one principle bound the entire medieval world together. Punishment was meant to be seen. Whether it was a noble's head displayed on a pike, a merchant's ruined stall in the marketplace, or a peasant tied to the stocks, justice thrived on visibility. It was the spectacle, the drama, that gave punishment its power. In an age where literacy was rare and laws were not written for most to read, punishments themselves became the text, a living book of warnings and lessons visible to all. The role of spectacle cannot be overstated. Executions, mutilations, and public shamings were not hidden away. They were performances staged with precision. Crowds gathered, not just for morbid curiosity, but because attendance was often expected. Children, too, were brought to witness, taught through fear what words on a page could never instill. The condemned became unwilling actors in a play that reaffirmed the authority of king, lord, or church. Every lash, every cry, every final breath was part of a lesson carved into collective memory. And yet, within this theater of punishment, humanity flickered. Chronicles record moments when crowds turned against executioners, rushing to free a condemned man if they felt the judgment unjust. At times, the sheer brutality of a punishment stirred pity instead of fear, and murmurs spread through villages questioning the fairness of the law. These instances were rare, but they revealed the delicate balance that authorities had to maintain. Punishment had to be severe enough to deter, but not so excessive that it broke the bond between ruler and ruled. As centuries passed, punishments began to shift. By the later Middle Ages, prisons once little more than holding cells started to play a larger role. The idea that confinement could itself be a punishment slowly gained ground. This reflected subtle changes in how society thought about crime and correction, while still far from modern notions of rehabilitation. These shifts suggested that medieval people were beginning to ask questions about the effectiveness and morality of endless spectacle and brutality. Still, in the heart of the medieval world, punishment was inseparable from power. It defined relationships between lords and peasants, between clergy and laypeople, between rulers and rebels. It whispered warnings in every market, echoed in every church sermon, and loomed over every act of disobedience. And though the forms of punishment varied through status, geography, or faith, the purpose remained constant: to remind each person that their life was not entirely their own, that their body, reputation, and even soul could be seized in the name of justice. This layering of punishment across classes and regions paints a fuller picture of medieval justice, one far more complex than the gallows alone. It was a system woven into every thread of life. From the way peasants whispered about their neighbors to the way nobles calculated their risks in rebellion, punishment was never just about crime. It was about identity, order, and the fragile balance of a society forever teetering between chaos and control. And yet, beneath it all, a quiet question lingered. Could there be another way? Could justice be something more than pain and spectacle? Those questions would not fully blossom until centuries later. But even in the darkest dungeons of the Middle Ages, the seeds of doubt had already been planted. If there is one subject that clings to the popular imagination when thinking about medieval punishments, it is torture. Iron devices, stretching racks, spiked chairs, and flaming brands often come to mind, and while exaggerations and myths have blurred reality with legend, torture was undeniably part of the machinery of medieval justice. It was not an everyday practice, nor was it applied to every common thief or brawler. But when authorities sought confession or wished to extract truths hidden beneath silence, torture became the weapon of choice. The logic behind it was rooted in belief. Medieval society was governed by the conviction that truth was not only knowable but divinely sanctioned. Lies were sins, and sins carried eternal consequences. To withhold confession was to jeopardize the soul, and so to force confession by any means was, in the minds of many, a service to both justice and salvation. What seems to us barbaric was, to them, a grim necessity, a path toward cleansing the soul of falsehood. The rack is perhaps the most infamous of these tools, a wooden frame with rollers at either end. It stretched the human body beyond its natural limits, tearing ligaments and dislocating joints. Victims often screamed confessions long before bones snapped, though the damage to the body lingered long after words left the lips. The rack's effectiveness lay not only in pain but in anticipation. Prisoners, knowing what awaited, sometimes confessed before even touching the device, their minds unraveling at the sight of ropes being tied and levers turned. Another notorious method was the strapado. A prisoner's hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, only to be dropped suddenly. The sudden jolt often dislocated shoulders, leaving lasting injury. The strapado carried a cruel irony. It left no obvious wounds like cuts or bruises, making it an attractive method for authorities who wanted to claim that a prisoner had not been tortured in the traditional sense. It was the kind of semantic game that cloaked brutality in a veneer of legitimacy. Then there were the more subtle tools, thumbscrews that crushed fingers, iron boots filled with wedges hammered into the sides, or the torment of fire applied to tender flesh. These instruments were not invented for mere cruelty. They were designed with cold calculation to maximize compliance and confession. torturers often operated with terrifying precision, pushing victims to the edge of endurance but pulling back before death. Death was not the goal. Submission was. A dead prisoner could not testify, could not implicate others, and could not provide the satisfaction of a public admission. But torture was more than tools, and penance was theatre. The chamber in which it took place was often dim, the devices looming in shadows, chains rattling against stone walls. Prisoners were not only physically broken, but psychologically dismantled. Authorities knew that the mere sight of an Iron Maiden or spiked collar, even if never used, could be enough to loosen tongues. Torture was therefore as much about fear as it was about flesh. Who suffered torture? It was not applied to all criminals. Thieves, drunkards, and brawlers usually met their punishments without passing through a torture chamber. Torture was reserved for cases where confession was deemed necessary, heresy trials, accusations of treason, witchcraft hunts, and conspiracies against rulers or the church. These were crimes that threatened the very structure of medieval society, and so they demanded extraordinary measures. A merchant cheating at scales might lose his right hand, but a suspected heretic refusing to renounce their beliefs might be suspended on the strappado until words spilled forth. Heresy, in particular, brought torture to the forefront. The Church, determined to protect orthodoxy, saw stubborn silence as the greatest threat. Heretics were not just criminals, they were corrupters of souls, spreading poison through doctrine. To break them was to save not only their own soul, but the souls of those who might follow. Inquisition records reveal sessions of relentless questioning, punctuated by the creak of racks or the tightening of screws. Confessions flowed, but so too did falsehoods, as men and women under agony admitted to whatever their interrogators wished to hear. This raises a haunting truth. Torture was not about discovering reality. It was about affirming authority. A tortured confession did not necessarily reveal facts, revealed compliance. It turned defiance into submission, resistance into agreement. The justice system of the Middle Ages valued this transformation because it upheld the structures of church and crown. The actual veracity of words mattered less than the act of speaking them under sanction. Yet torture was not without critics. Even in its own time, voices rose questioning its reliability. Jurists, clerics, and chroniclers noted that men would confess to impossible crimes simply to end their torment. Tales circulated of prisoners admitting to flying through the air with demons or conspiring in plots they could not possibly have devised. Over time, these doubts eroded the unquestioned acceptance of torture as a means to truth. But in the high medieval period, its use persisted, woven into trials like thread into a tapestry. The public rarely saw torture directly. It took place in chambers, behind walls, but its echoes rippled outward. People whispered about the screams carried on night air from castle dungeons. Rumors grew about men and women broken in secret, their confessions displayed later in open court as proof. In this way, torture contributed to the larger theatre of punishment, hidden in performance but visible in effect. It became part of the law of justice, a shadowy presence that haunted towns and villages even when unseen. And there was another layer. Torture was not always permanent. A prisoner might endure it and live, released with broken joints or scarred flesh, returning to their community as living proof of authority's reach. Such survivors carried both physical and social marks. Some were pitied, others feared. Still others avoided altogether, as if the touch of the torturer had rendered them untouchable. Their existence was yet another reminder to all of the consequences of stepping beyond the accepted order. in its most chilling form. Torture was used not merely for confession, but for demonstration. A rebellious leader might be subjected to it publicly, his cries amplified by the crowd, the lesson burned into every ear. Though rarer than public executions, these instances of visible torture magnified its terror, ensuring that the memory lingered long after the victim had fallen silent. By the late Middle Ages, the tide began to shift. Legal scholars, influenced by Roman traditions and evolving ideas of evidence, increasingly questioned the place of torture. Some courts restricted its use, requiring corroborating evidence before it could be applied. Others demanded that confessions extracted under torture be repeated freely afterward, as if to cleanse them of coercion. These reforms signaled a slow, uneven path toward change, though the shadow of torture would linger in Europe well into the early modern era. For medieval people, however, torture remained a reality interwoven with their understanding of law. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also accepted, justified, even sanctified in some eyes. To them, it was not mere cruelty, but a tool flawed, brutal, but aligned with their vision of a world where truth had to be dragged from the body when lips refused to part. And so, in dim chambers beneath castles, in cloistered rooms of inquisitors, and in whispered tales carried by those who lived nearby, torture remained one of the darkest, yet most enduring aspects of medieval punishment. It was a practice that blurred the line between justice and cruelty, confession and coercion, truth and submission. In the silence that followed a victim's cries, rulers and churchmen heard what they wanted to hear: affirmation of their power and the fragile order they fought to maintain. As we reach the close of our journey through medieval punishment, it is important to remember that this system, brutal as it often appears, did not exist in a vacuum. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake, nor violence detached from meaning. Every pillory, every execution, every tortured confession, and every exile had its place within a society structured by faith, hierarchy, and fear. The punishments were reflections of deeper beliefs, that disorder must be corrected, that sins carried consequences both earthly and eternal, and that authority needed constant reinforcement to survive. But no society remains unchanged forever. By the late Middle Ages, cracks had begun to form in the older systems of justice. Populations were growing, towns were expanding, and literacy, though still limited, was slowly spreading. With these shifts came new ideas about law, responsibility, and evidence. While punishments of shocking severity still occurred, a slow movement toward refinement and restriction was underway. One of the clearest changes was in the use of public spectacle. Executions, once staged with pageantry to awe and terrify, gradually became less about communal ritual and more about efficiency. Cities began to confine executions to specific spaces: gallows, fields outside town walls, or designated execution sites where crowds still gathered, but in a controlled environment. The chaotic, carnival-like atmosphere of early medieval punishments gave way to more regulated ceremonies, as rulers sought not only to punish, but to demonstrate orderly governance. Torture, too, began to face scrutiny. By the 13th and 14th centuries, legal scholars in universities, influenced by Roman law, argued for stricter evidentiary standards. They warned that confessions obtained under torment could not always be trusted. Some courts, especially in Italy and parts of France, required additional evidence before torture could be permitted. Others insisted that a confession must be repeated voluntarily afterward, without the presence of pain, to be legally binding. These developments did not eliminate torture. but they planted seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into broader reforms. Another shift came with the rise of professional legal systems. Early medieval justice had been deeply local, rooted in community custom and enforced by lords, priests, and village courts. But as monarchs strengthened their power, centralized systems of law began to take hold. Royal courts, staffed by educated clerics and trained officials, started to standardize procedures. This professionalization did not necessarily make punishments kinder, but it did make them more predictable. No longer could a village mob invent punishments, on the spot at least, not without risking intervention from higher authority. In some places, alternative punishments emerged that sought to replace physical torment with financial or custodial penalties. Fines became more common, particularly for lesser crimes, offering rulers a steady source of income while sparing offenders bodily harm. Prisons, long used primarily as holding spaces for those awaiting trial or execution, slowly began to take on the role of punishment in their own right. By the late medieval period, some offenders could be sentenced to terms of confinement, labor, or banishment rather than immediate mutilation. Yet prisons were far from the modern institutions we might imagine. They were dark, unsanitary, and often deadly. Rats scurried across stone floors, disease spread unchecked, and food was meager unless families provided support. Still, the idea that time itself could serve as punishment represented a profound change in thinking. Instead of breaking the body, the law could confine it, restricting freedom and marking the offender through absence rather than scars. Religion, of course, remained deeply entangled with justice. Confession, penance, and pilgrimage were still woven into punishment throughout the later Middle Ages. Some offenders were sentenced to long pilgrimages, walking across dangerous lands to holy sites as acts of atonement. Others were made to stand barefoot in churchyards, wearing sackcloth and begging forgiveness from their neighbors. These rituals combined humiliation with spiritual correction, blurring the line between earthly penalty and eternal salvation. The most dramatic punishments, however, did not disappear overnight. Executions remained central to medieval life. Hanging, beheading, and burning continued into the Renaissance and beyond, often accompanied by the same ritualized staging that had defined earlier centuries. The gallows still rose as landmarks of justice, and executioners still carried out their grim duties in public squares. But as time passed, the justifications shifted. Where once rulers emphasized divine justice, later generations began to stress civic order, law enforcement, and deterrence. The language changed, even if the ropes and axes did not. For ordinary people, the fear of punishment never truly lessened. If anything, the centralization of authority made justice seem even more inescapable. Royal decrees, standardized courts, and traveling judges carried the reach of law further than before, leaving fewer pockets of exemption. At the same time, the possibility of appeal, clemency, or pardon introduced a new dynamic. Justice was not only terrifying, but also political. A king's mercy could save a life as surely as his wrath could end it, and subjects never forgot the dual power of punishment and forgiveness. Looking back now, it is easy to recoil at the sheer brutality of medieval punishments. Branding, irons, mutilations, whippings, and torture chambers speak to a world where violence was public, intimate, and expected. But to stop there is to miss the larger truth. These punishments were not random acts of cruelty. They were part of a system of meaning. They spoke to beliefs about sin, authority, and community. They embodied a worldview where justice was not abstract but visible, where suffering was both deterrent and penance, and where order was maintained not only through law but through fear. And yet, the fact that medieval punishments strike us as shocking today is itself a reminder of how far societies have shifted. What once seemed natural, necessary, even righteous, is now unthinkable in most parts of the world. The stocks that humiliated, the gallows that loomed, the racks that stretched bodazole, of these have become museum relics or symbols and stories meant to horrify. They remind us of the distance between past and present, but also of the capacity of human societies to evolve, to rethink, to challenge even the practices most deeply woven into their fabric. The end of the Middle Ages did not end brutality. Early modern Europe witnessed witch hunts, mass executions, and tortures that rivaled anything the medieval world produced. But alongside that darkness grew the first glimmers of more humane justice, codified laws, systems of evidence, debates about human rights, and eventually the abolition of the very punishments that once defined medieval justice. So, when we ask what punishments were really like in medieval times, the answer is not simple. They were cruel, yes, but also meaningful. They were terrifying, but also accepted. They were part of a society that believed pain could teach, suffering could cleanse, and public shame could restore balance. They remind us not only of the brutality of the past, but of the ways in which every society, including our own, shapes justice according to its deepest fears and highest ideals. And perhaps that is the lasting lesson. Medieval punishments may belong to history, but the questions they raise remain alive. How far should a society go to enforce order? What balance exists between deterrence and cruelty, between justice and mercy, between punishment and rehabilitation? These are questions that echo across centuries. From the medieval pillory to the modern prison, the gallows may have vanished from our town squares, and the rack may gather dust in museums, but the challenge of justice, its fairness, its humanity, its power remains as present as ever. The story of medieval punishments is not just a tale of the past. It is a mirror reflecting the ongoing struggle to balance order with compassion, and authority with the dignity of those who live under it.